The Iron Fortress. Life in Kolyma. The helicopter descended through thick fog, and Dmitry Volkov pressed his face against the small window, catching his first glimpse of Kolyma Fortress prison. It rose from the frozen wasteland like a monument to human suffering, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel surrounded by multiple layers of razor-wire fencing, guard towers, and searchlights that cut through the perpetual twilight of the Arctic region. The temperature outside was minus 45 degrees Celsius. Inside the prison walls, it might as well have been the depths of hell. Dmitry was 38 years old, though his weathered face and gray-streaked hair made him look 50. He had been sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes he partially committed and partially took the fall for, a complex story of organized crime, betrayal, and the kind of moral compromise that seemed quaint in the world he now inhabited. But those details barely mattered anymore. What mattered was that he was here, in the most notorious and isolated prison facility in all of Russia, where the rules of civilization had long since eroded, replaced by a brutal code of survival that few outsiders could comprehend. The helicopter touched down on the landing pad inside the main compound. Dmitry was shackled to 2 guards, one on each side, as he was led down the steps. The wind was so fierce it nearly knocked him over, and the cold seemed to penetrate his very bones within seconds. The guards' faces were covered with thermal masks, their eyes hard and empty. This was routine for them, for they moved with the efficiency of men who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before. The reception building was no warmer than the outside. It was a cavernous structure with bare concrete walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the unmistakable smell of bleach mixed with human waste and desperation. An elderly officer with a scarred face sat behind a desk, not looking up as Dmitry was led before him. "Volkov, Dmitry Sergeyevich," the officer said, reading from a file. His voice was devoid of emotion. "Life sentence, organized crime syndicate, extortion, assault with aggravating circumstances." He finally looked up, his single good eye. The other was a milky white from an old wound, boring into Dmitry's soul. "Welcome to Kolyma. You will follow the rules, or you will die. You will work, or you will die. You will obey the inmates, the guards, and the system, or you will die. Do you understand?" Dmitry nodded. I said, "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Dmitry replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. He hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since arriving at the transfer facility in Moscow. "Good. You'll be assigned to Cell Block D, Level 3. You'll work in the mine during the day, assuming you're deemed fit. You'll eat what you're given. You'll sleep when you're told. You'll wake when you're told. Any deviation from this will result in disciplinary measures." The officer paused, then leaned back in his chair. "Kolyma is not like other prisons. The world outside doesn't care what happens here. The investigators don't come. The journalists don't visit. No lawyers show up to challenge our procedures. You are, for all practical purposes, dead to the world. Your only hope for survival is to understand the hierarchy and find your place in it." The guards escorted Dmitry deeper into the prison complex. They passed through multiple security checkpoints, each more imposing than the last. Armed men in gray uniforms watched from behind reinforced glass, their fingers resting on trigger guards. At one point, they passed a window that looked out over a courtyard where perhaps 200 inmates were doing forced labor, breaking rocks, hauling materials, digging. Despite the extreme cold, many were shirtless, their bodies covered in tattoos and scars. Their faces were masks of resigned suffering. Dmitry's cell was on the 3rd level of Cell Block D. It measured perhaps 3 meters by 2 meters. There was a concrete bunk with a thin mattress, a metal toilet without a seat, and a sink with a single faucet. A small barred window, positioned too high to see through comfortably, offered a view of the Arctic sky, perpetually gray, perpetually hostile. The walls were covered in writing, names, dates, epitaphs, and messages carved into the concrete by men who had occupied this space before him. Some of the dates went back 15 years. His cellmate was a man named Grigory, a stocky Chechen with a scarred face and cruel eyes. He was in his 50s but moved with the coiled energy of a much younger man. When Dmitri entered, Grigory was sitting on the upper bunk smoking a hand-rolled cigarette made from dried plant matter. "You're new," Grigory said, not as a question but as an observation. "Yes," Dmitri replied, setting down his meager belongings, a blanket, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a bar of soap. "From Moscow? Originally from St. Petersburg," Grigory nodded, taking a drag on his cigarette. "You've got the look of a city man. That might help you, or it might get you killed. Depends on how you handle yourself." He exhaled smoke that filled the small space. "The rules here are simple, and they're absolute. First, you respect the hierarchy. There are the bosses, the Vori. They run everything. Then there are the strong ones, the ones who have earned respect through violence or wit. Then there are the workers, the ones who do the jobs and keep their heads down. Then there are the broken ones, the ones who've given up or been broken by the system. And then there are the snitches and the weak ones. You don't want to end up in those last two categories." "Where do you fit?" Dmitri asked, trying to gauge the situation. "I'm one of the strong ones," Grigory said, with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been here for 23 years. I've killed 7 men in this prison and the authorities know it, but they can't prove it. Or maybe they can, and they just don't care because I keep the blocks peaceful and productive. Either way, I have a certain amount of respect. And because I'm your cellmate, some of that respect will extend to you, but you'll need to earn your own standing." Over the next several weeks, Dmitri began to understand the reality of life in Kolyma Fortress. The prison operated on multiple levels, like a feudal society transplanted to a concrete wasteland. At the top were the Vori, the criminal masters, men who had accumulated years or decades of imprisonment and had built networks of power within the prison walls. Some of them controlled entire cell blocks through a system of subordinates and enforcers. They made the real decisions about who got extra food, who got comfortable jobs, who got thrown into solitary confinement, and who got killed. Below them were the strong prisoners like Grigory, men who had proven themselves through violence, cunning, or a combination of both. They served as lieutenants and enforcers for the Vori, maintaining order through fear and the occasional demonstration of brutality. Below them were the regular prisoners, the vast majority, who worked, obeyed, and tried to survive day by day without drawing too much attention to themselves. At the very bottom were the untouchables, the child molesters, the informants, and the men who had somehow fallen so far that other prisoners would gladly kill them for the smallest transgression or even just for entertainment. Dmitri's first work assignment was in the mine. Kolyma had been mined for gold during the Soviet era, and the prison labor camps had been instrumental in that extraction. Now the mines were mostly exhausted, but the authorities found plenty of use for prisoner labor. Breaking rocks, hauling materials, expanding the tunnel systems, clearing ice. The work was brutal, the cold was absolute, and accidents were common. Dmitri had already heard rumors that at least 1 prisoner per week died from cold exposure, falls, or tunnel collapses. His first day in the mine was a baptism by fire. He was given a pickaxe and assigned to a work gang of about 20 prisoners, supervised by a single guard who sat in a heated booth at the entrance of the tunnel. The gang was broken into teams of 4 or 5, each responsible for extracting a certain quota of rock. The quota determined whether they got an extra ration of food at dinner. Dmitri was paired with Grigory and 2 other men, Victor, a soft-spoken man from Moscow with intelligent eyes, and Oleg, a massive brute of a man who barely spoke but seemed to understand what was expected of him. The work was exhausting. Dmitri's hands blistered and bled within the first hour. His muscles screamed in protest. The cold was so intense that it felt like his lungs were being scraped raw with every breath. But there was something almost meditative about the work. The repetitive motion of swinging the pickaxe, the rhythmic breaking of stone, the physical exertion that left no room for thought. It was, in some strange way, a relief. For a few hours, Dmitri could lose himself in the work and forget about the walls around him, the guards watching him, the knowledge that he would spend the rest of his life in this place. "You've got good rhythm," Victor said during a brief water break. "You won't last long if you don't pace yourself, but at least you're not going to hurt yourself immediately." "How long have you been here?" Dmitri asked. 8 years," Another 12 to go if I don't catch pneumonia or get stabbed in the yard. Victor smiled without humor. I was an accountant before. I cooked the books for a pharmaceutical company. Now I break rocks. It's funny how life works out. That night, after dinner, a thin gruel that was mostly potato and salt, Dmitri lay on his bunk and felt the cold settling into his bones. The heating in the cell block was minimal, and the wind howled through gaps in the walls. Many of the other cells had men who moved around during the night, unable to sleep. Some coughed, hacking, wet coughs that suggested tuberculosis or pneumonia. Others talked quietly or argued. One man, 2 cells over, screamed for what seemed like hours before guards arrived and beat him into silence. "You'll get used to it," Grigori said from the bunk above. "The noise, the cold, the hunger. Your body will adjust, your mind will adjust, or you'll kill yourself, and the problem will solve itself." "Is that what happens to most people?" Dmitri asked. "Most? No. Most people adapt. They find a role, they do their job, they try not to die. A few make it out, though out usually means the infirmary or the grave. Some go insane, genuinely crazy. They get transferred to the psychiatric ward, which is its own special kind of hell. A few kill themselves. Some, the lucky ones, eventually get transferred to a regular prison when they're too old to be dangerous anymore. That's like winning the lottery." Dmitri was in Kolyma for 3 years before he met Viktor Korsakov, the man who would change everything. Korsakov was a lifer like Dmitri, but he had arrived almost 20 years earlier. He was now in his 60s, with long gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was one of the Vori, a man with influence and power. More importantly, he was an intellectual, a former university professor who had been imprisoned for his involvement in organized crime through a network of academic black markets and intellectual property theft. They first spoke in the exercise yard, a concrete space surrounded by 30-foot walls and guarded by men in towers with rifles. The yard was a brutal microcosm of the prison hierarchy, with different groups claiming different sections and the weaker prisoners sticking to the edges, trying not to attract attention. "You're Volkov," Korsakov said, appearing suddenly at Dmitri's side. It wasn't a question. The accountant turned rock-breaker. "You keep to yourself? You do your work, you don't cause trouble. That's commendable, but it's also limiting. I'm just trying to survive," Dmitri replied carefully. "Survival is the minimum, but you have something more than just survival in you. I can see it. You think too much, you observe, you store information. That's a useful trait." Korsakov paused as 2 guards passed nearby. When they were out of earshot, he continued, "I have a need for someone with those qualities. Someone who can manage information, who can see patterns, who can make connections. The work pays better than the mine, and the working conditions are considerably more tolerable. Would you be interested?" Dmitri's mind raced. Accepting a position working for one of the Vori meant entering into a system of obligations and dependencies. It meant being tied to Korsakov's fate, which meant danger, but it also meant better food, better conditions, and possibly a better chance of surviving to the end of his sentence. "What's the work?" Dmitri asked. "Administrative," Korsakov said. "Managing the internal economy of the prison, tracking resources, calculating ratios, managing distributions. You'd be working in what we call the office, a secure area near the administrative block. The pay is cigarettes, sometimes money, sometimes favors. It's not glamorous, but it's better than being in the mine." "Why me?" Korsakov smiled slightly. "Because you're useful, but not ambitious. You won't try to challenge me for power. You won't try to move beyond your station. You'll do the work well, and you'll be grateful for the opportunity. And because I respect the fact that you haven't tried to kill anyone or get killed in 3 years, that takes discipline." Dmitri accepted. The office was a revelation. It was a small space, about 10 meters by 8 meters, located in an administrative block that was separate from the main prison compound. It had a desk, filing cabinets, and even a small heater that kept the temperature above freezing. More importantly, it had windows that looked out over the surrounding landscape, not the prison, but the broader Arctic terrain beyond the walls. Dmitri's job was to track the internal economy of the prison. Kolyma Fortress had developed, over decades, its own internal system of trade and economy. Inmates could earn money through their work assignments, and this money could be used to purchase better food, better clothing, cigarettes, alcohol, or various other goods that were smuggled in by corrupt guards. Some of the goods were also produced internally: vodka made from prison supplies, bread baked in secret, various luxuries manufactured in hidden workshops. The Vori controlled this economy, and they relied on careful record-keeping to ensure that all transactions were properly documented and that all participants understood the rules. Dimitri's job was to maintain this system, to track flows of money and goods, to calculate who owed what to whom, and to maintain the complicated ledger that formed the foundation of the internal power structure. It was, in many ways, the same work he had done in his previous life as an accountant. But instead of managing corporate finances, he was managing the internal economy of the most dangerous prison in Russia. And instead of his mistakes being resolved with a lawsuit or a regulatory fine, they would be resolved with violence. "You understand the stakes?" Korsakov asked on Dimitri's first day in the office. "I do." "Good. Then we won't have any problem." In the office, Dimitri met other prisoners who worked on administrative tasks. There was Alexei, a former lawyer from the pre-Soviet era who handled legal documentation and negotiation with the authorities. There was Maxim, a former engineer who managed the physical infrastructure, the heating systems, the water systems, the electrical systems. And there was Katya, the only female guard in the entire facility, a hard woman in her 40s who worked in the administrative section and served as the liaison between the Vori and the official prison administration. Of all of them, Dimitri found himself most drawn to Alexei. The old lawyer was perhaps in his 70s, though he claimed to be in his 60s. He had been imprisoned since 1989, before the fall of the Soviet Union, for crimes he refused to discuss. He was refined, educated, and he had the ability to explain the prison's complex system of rules and codes in a way that made sense. "The prison is a microcosm of society," Alexei explained one evening as they worked late in the office. "It has its laws, its customs, its hierarchies. The difference is that the laws here are not written down in any official document. They exist only in the collective understanding of the inmates. And they are far more strictly enforced than any official law, because the consequences of breaking them are immediate and violent." "How long have you been trying to maintain that system?" Dimitri asked. "Since I arrived. I was a lawyer, so I was naturally suited to understanding and maintaining legal systems, even illegal ones. At first, I resisted it. I tried to maintain my dignity, my principles, but I learned, eventually, that principles are a luxury that most of us cannot afford. Now I see the system as almost beautiful, a perfect representation of human nature and our need for order." As months turned into years, Dimitri's position in the prison hierarchy solidified. He was no longer a new arrival, no longer an unknown quantity. He was known as Volkov, the accountant who worked in the office, the one who managed the money and kept the records straight. He was respected enough that other prisoners greeted him respectfully in the yard. He was feared enough that no one tried to steal from him or disrespect him. But he was also increasingly trapped. The longer he worked for Korsakov, the deeper he became entangled in the criminal system that ran the prison. He began to understand that his job was not just maintaining records, but also laundering money, coordinating smuggling operations, and in some cases, managing the logistics of violence. He discovered that he was maintaining records not just of legitimate internal transactions, but also of murders, specific murders that Korsakov or other Vori had ordered, with specific targets and specific outcomes recorded in a coded ledger that only Alexei and Dimitri could truly read. "You're learning the real nature of the system," Alexei said one evening after Dimitri had discovered a coded entry referring to a prisoner who had died in an apparent accident in the mine 3 weeks earlier. "This is not just an economic system. It's a control system. It's a way for the Vori to maintain absolute power by making sure that everyone in the prison, including the guards, including the administration, understands that they are watching, that they are recording, that they are capable of reaching anyone, anywhere, at any time." "I didn't sign up to be part of a murder operation," Dimitri said, feeling a wave of something that might have been guilt or might have been fear. "No one signs up for these things," Alexei replied. We all end up here, and we all end up doing things we never thought we would do. The question is not whether you're part of the system. You are, and you always will be, as long as you live here. The question is whether you can live with that, or whether you'll find a way to end it. How? How do you end it? We're in prison, Alexei. We're completely locked up. We're completely controlled. There are ways, Alexei said, his eyes distant. Death is one way, and it can come in many forms. Madness is another, and sometimes, very rarely, there is escape. Not physical escape, that's nearly impossible, but escape in other ways. Political escape. You expose the truth about what happens here, and you make it impossible for the system to continue. The problem is that the truth is very powerful and very dangerous to people on both sides of the wall. Before Dmitri could ask Alexei what he meant, the old lawyer was transferred. No explanation was given. One day Alexei was there, and the next day he was gone. Dmitri heard rumors that he had been transferred to a hospital facility, that he had been killed, that he had managed to contact someone on the outside and had been moved to a different location for his safety. None of the rumors could be confirmed. The transfer deeply unsettled Dmitri. It suggested that even someone with Alexei's level of education and experience was not safe. Not truly. It suggested that the only way to maintain safety was to remain small, remain invisible, remain completely complicit in whatever the Vori wanted to do. Several months after Alexei's disappearance, Korsakov called Dmitri into his cell, a private cell in a secured section of the prison that served as his office and personal residence. "I'm being transferred," Korsakov said simply. "In 2 weeks. They're moving me to a regular prison in the Urals. I'm old. I've served a significant portion of my sentence, and they've decided I'm no longer a threat." Dmitri felt a chill run through his body. "What happens to me?" "That depends on you. The new Vori, the one who will take my place. He's a different kind of man. Younger, more ambitious, less interested in maintaining the kind of order I've maintained. He'll want to know if you're loyal, if you're useful, if you're a threat. If you can convince him of the first two, you'll be fine. If you can't, you'll become expendable." "How do I convince him?" "By demonstrating value. By showing him that you're more useful alive and working than dead and replaced. The easiest way to do that is to give him something he wants. A gift of loyalty. A demonstration of your understanding that he is now in charge and that you will serve him as you served me." "What kind of gift?" Korsakov smiled, and for the first time Dmitri saw genuine malice in his eyes. "Victor, your old friend from the mine, the accountant from Moscow. I want you to tell me everything you know about him. His weaknesses, his connections, his secrets, everything. And then, I want you to watch as he pays the price for not being as useful as you are." Dmitri felt something break inside him at that moment. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it was fundamental. He understood, in that instant, that there was no way to survive in Kolyma without becoming part of the violence, without actively participating in the harm that was done to others. Survival meant complicity. It meant betraying friends. It meant watching people be hurt. It meant becoming so morally compromised that your own humanity was barely recognizable to you. He thought about his life before prison. He thought about the man he had been, an accountant, certainly, but not an evil man. He had made mistakes, gotten involved with the wrong people, but he had never been this. He had never been someone who would sacrifice a friend to save himself. "No," Dmitri said quietly. Korsakov's expression didn't change. No, I won't do it. I won't betray Victor, and I won't be part of whatever this is. I'm done." For a moment, there was silence. Korsakov regarded Dmitri with an expression that was almost sad, as if he was disappointed by what he was seeing. "Then you're expendable," Korsakov said finally, "which means you'll be dead within a month, possibly within a week. I suggest you consider what kind of death you want. It could be quick, or it could be very slow. That choice, at least, I can give you." Dmitri left Korsakov's cell and walked back toward his own block, fully understanding that he had just sentenced himself to death. He felt strangely a sense of relief, the burden of complicity, the weight of moral compromise, the constant awareness of his own corruption. It would all be over soon. But something unexpected happened. The next morning, Dmitri was called to the administrative office. When he arrived, he found not a guard, but a woman in a dark suit, a representative of the Russian Federal Service. She was waiting in the office, along with Katya, the female guard, and two other officials. "Dmitry Sergeyevich Volkov?" the woman asked. "Yes. My name is Major Katerina Volkov. I am from the Federal Investigation Service. We've been conducting an investigation into corruption and organized crime within Kolyma Fortress Prison. We have reason to believe that you have information that could assist us in that investigation." Dmitry's mind raced. This was not an internal prison matter. This was federal. This was external. This was hope. "We know that you work in this office. We know that you have access to records that document criminal activities within the prison. And we know that you have, as of yesterday, fallen out of favor with the senior criminal leadership. These facts suggest to us that you might be willing to cooperate." "If I cooperate, what happens?" Dmitry asked carefully. "That depends on the extent and quality of your cooperation. But I can tell you that we have the authority to transfer you to a different facility to protect you from retaliation and potentially to reduce your sentence in exchange for testimony. However, I should be clear. If you choose to cooperate, there is no going back. You will be marked as an informant for the rest of your life. In prison, that means that you will be permanently unsafe in any standard facility. You will have to go into protective custody, probably for the rest of your sentence. Outside of prison, if you ever get out, you will have to assume a new identity and start over completely. Your old life will be gone. Your family, your connections, your history, all of it gone. It was an impossible choice. Cooperate and lose everything, or refuse and die. But in the space between those two extremes, Dmitry saw something that he hadn't seen in years. The possibility of redemption. Not freedom, not really, but the possibility of choosing to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. "I'll cooperate," Dmitry said. The extraction took 3 days. Dmitry was kept in an isolation cell, separated from the general population, while the federal investigators gathered the evidence and the records that he had helped them identify. He provided information about the criminal structure of the prison, about the Vori, about the system of murders and violence that had been orchestrated over the years. He gave them names, dates, and details. He gave them the coded ledgers that documented years of crimes. On the 3rd day, he was transferred out of Kolyma. He was placed in a federal vehicle, driven through the Arctic landscape, and transported to a federal facility in Moscow. From there, he was moved to a smaller, more secure facility in the Urals, where he remained in protective custody while the investigation continued. Victor found him a year later after being transferred to the same facility for his own protection. They sat in the exercise yard of the new prison, which was smaller and much more humane than Kolyma, and Victor simply smiled and said, "I always knew you'd find a way out." "I didn't find a way out," Dmitry replied. "I just found a way to stop going deeper in." The investigation that Dmitry's cooperation enabled led to the arrest and indictment of 17 people, including Korsakov and 3 other Vori. It led to an overhaul of the management system at Kolyma Fortress Prison. It led to the federal government finally paying serious attention to what was happening in the prison system, but it also led to Dmitry spending the next 8 years in protective custody, cut off from the world, unable to have meaningful contact with anyone outside of the prison system. His family, believing him dead, had moved on with their lives. By the time his sentence was reduced and he was eventually released 23 years after his arrest, he was a different man. He emerged into a world that had changed drastically, with technology and culture that were almost unrecognizable to him. He took a new name, a new identity. He got a small apartment in a regional city, worked a quiet job, and tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But he never forgot Kolyma. He never forgot the cold, the darkness, the weight of moral compromise. He never forgot the men he had known there, the ones who hadn't made it out, the ones who would spend the rest of their lives in that frozen fortress of human misery. Sometimes on cold nights when the wind howled outside his apartment, he thought about Alexei and wondered what had happened to the old lawyer. He thought about Grigory, his first cellmate, and hoped that the strong one had managed to survive. He thought about all the unnamed prisoners, the faces he had seen in the yard but never known. the lives that had ended in caves beneath the ice. And he understood that survival in a place like Kolyma was not about strength or cunning or luck. It was about the moment when you chose to do something other than what the system demanded, regardless of the consequences. It was about finding the thread of humanity that remained inside you, even after everything had been done to strip it away, and choosing to follow that thread even if it led to the end. That choice, he came to believe, was the only real freedom that existed in a place like Kolyma Fortress Prison. Not the freedom of physical escape, which was impossible, but the freedom to refuse to become completely what the system wanted you to become. That freedom cost everything, but it was the only freedom that mattered.